Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speaker Series. We are thrilled that tonight we have two speakers, Dr. Ross Edwards and Dr. Joshua Abreu. The title of Dr. Edwards' talk is The Hunting of Injustice, and Dr. Abreu will talk about recentering your social justice work with equity mindfulness. A warm welcome to both of you. My name is Shiva, and I'm the co-chair of this committee. I'm joined today by my co-chair Janan and other planning committee members, and Neda and Mena. At this time, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors. With their financial support, we can sustain this series. So I'm going to share with you the slides of our supporters. As you see here, we have comprehensive neuropsychological services at the platinum level, and I'm proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company, also Hartford Healthcare. Thank you so much for your help. And you see your beautiful names as supporters and friends here. Also, thank you so much to the Connecticut Health Foundation for their support that Dr. Ankley made it possible for us to receive the grant to improve the infrastructure of our planning committee. Now I'm going to turn it over to Janan to share with you additional information.
Thank you, Shiva. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Janan Wyatt, and I serve as the co-chair for this committee. And on behalf of the Planning Committee, we are thrilled that you could join us this evening, and we hope that you continue to attend future speaker sessions. The Social Justice Speaker Series is in our second year of programming. We're actually coming up on the end of our second year of programming. So kudos to us, as well as kudos to you for continuing to support our efforts. As a committee, we are committed to combating racism, promoting community healing and social justice, and most importantly, being advocates for change. The CPA Social Justice Speaker Series offers free monthly meetings to CPA members. We also welcome all of those in the broader Connecticut community and to our nationwide supporters as well. We are excited about the two presentations this evening, and I welcome you to the Speaker Series. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's presentations, and most importantly, we hope we see you soon. I'm going to turn it back over to Shiva so that she can introduce both of our speakers.
Thank you, Janan. So, Dr. Ross Edwards is an associate professor of political science and dean of academic affairs at Albertus Magnus College, where he teaches classes on modern political philosophy, global social movements, democratic theory, and international relations. His research is focused on intergenerational political responsibility, the relationship between memory and political action, and the connections between global imperialism and the contemporary rise of authoritarian politics around the world. In addition to this teaching, he serves as a member of Albertus Magnus College Justice Panel Working Group. He is a former professional ballet dancer, and he received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2015. Welcome, Dr. Edwards. And now, Dr. Joshua Abreu. He is the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence and assistant professor of sociology at Albertus Magnus College. Dr. Abreu's work has mainly focused on understanding and supporting educators' process of integrating educational equity into their teaching practices. At Albertus, Dr. Abreu does this work through the day-to-day programming of CTLE, but also through his work on the new general education program and coordinator of Experiential Learning Day. Joshua has several peer-reviewed publications on educational equity and higher education and has presented in national conferences. Prior to Albertus, Joshua completed his doctoral work at the University of Connecticut and now lives in Wallingford with his partner, Maciel, and 2 children, Sky and Levi. Also, I wanted just to add this, that a few days ago, we received this information that he received the award for his work for equity in education. Congratulations. So welcome, both of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Edwards to start off the talk.
So, thank you very much, Shiva. Yeah, I don't think I can top that introduction, so I kind of want to just sign off and leave it like that. No, so I am a political scientist by training, political philosopher really by training and choice. So thank you for the opportunity to let me kind of crash this meeting. So my talk today is really coming out of a course that I designed at Albertus. And really the focus of it for me was that I wanted my students to be able to develop a language and a theoretical framework so that they could understand what I think are some very, very important issues, specifically within the United States, but I think you can also extrapolate this to understanding political movements in Canada, Australia, throughout Central America. And these are really complex concepts and complex ideas. And I wanted to try to create a language and a framework so that my students could understand that, these difficult concepts. And so this is kind of born out of that. And so I'm going to, let me pull up my slides for you and we can get going. So this is a class that I created. It's a politics and film class for my students. And so I usually get a lot of students to sign up because they love film and they think we're going to watch a lot of movies. And so I usually get, 20 or so students. And then they realize pretty quickly that this is going to be a very different politics and film class. So I use the frame of haunted houses to talk about the notion of enduring injustice, especially in the United States. But again, a lot of students have extrapolated this to talk about calls for reparations and justice movements in Canada. We see this in Australia as well. We've seen this as well, like with the Zapatista movement in Mexico and things like that. So I kind of want to take you through the framework and why I think these terms and these ideas are really important, and not just in an academic setting, but I think that there are ways that we can engage politically with some very, very thorny, but very important ideas. So I kind of want to talk about why I came up with this idea, or why I settled on this idea of the haunted house. And it really has to do with the dynamic of haunted houses. In political science, oftentimes we like to deal with pop culture. So, we offer a lot of classes where we talk about like zombies and things like that. And there's a lot of writing on zombies. And great book on international relations and zombies. I recommend it. Daniel Dresner wrote it. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about political science and zombies, or political science and alien movies, or things like that, is there's always the dynamic where you're looking at the relationship between a political society and something that is an outsider, something that comes from the outside and is some sort of an invasion, some sort of a threat, and how the community responds to that threat. And the thing that I've always found fascinating and kind of scary about haunted houses is the dynamic of a haunted house, which is fundamentally different. Obviously, it's a confrontation with the spectral other, right? You can think of any haunted house movie. The family, mom, dad, usually a little kid moves in. Suddenly, the pots and pans are banging and the doors are closing and opening. And there's this ghostly presence that the family has to confront. But the interesting thing about this dynamic is that this ghost is not an outsider, right? The thing that makes the haunting so terrifying is that the ghost is actually an insider in a way, right? The ghost is somehow has a claim to that territory, to that community, literally to the house. It is a previous inhabitant. So this is not an outsider disrupting the world. This is an internal disruption, right? This is the house's disorder, the political society is disordered, not because of an outside threat, but because of an inside force. And so the ghost, in a sense, has a very legitimate claim right? A legitimate claim to sovereignty, perhaps, a legitimate claim to territory, right? This maybe was the owner of the house. This was someone who lived there previously, right? There is a legitimate claim for justice, a legitimate cry for justice. And that leads us to responsibility. And we're going to talk about a few of these things. The larger project, it really brings all of this together, an engaged discussion about sovereignty and how we think about it. I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight. I'm going to focus mostly on this notion of justice and responsibility. So what is a haunting politically and socially, right? How do we take that metaphor and use it to understand our world? I think that Avery Gordon, a sociologist who wrote this great book called Ghostly Matters, I think offers a really good example, right? The haunting, writes, is one way in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impact felt in everyday life, especially, sorry for the typo, when they are supposedly over and done with. Slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is denied, as in free labor or national security. A way to think about this is it's a political return of the repressed, right? It's an injustice that we try to forget or we try to overlook. We think it's something in the past, but we realize it's not over and done with. It's not in the past. It reverberates into the present. And what this also does is it forces us to recognize that any political society is radically historical in nature. We always have to be confronting our historical legacies. We can't hide behind this presentist notion, right? That things in the past are over and done with, that the injustices in the past are over and done with, that the past is the past and we live in the present. But instead, we need to acknowledge that the past radically informs how we experience the present and what the shape of our present is, and therefore has to inform how we engage politically in the present. So my argument would be that this notion of a haunting, or seeing our world as shot through with these hauntings, turns our attention toward issues of injustice. And this is something that political science has worked on for a while. A lot of other disciplines have worked on for a while. What we've traditionally called historic or historical injustice. And we have authors like W. James Booth who have talked about this. Lori Balfour has talked about this. And traditionally, what we're talking about is this notion of memory justice, right? Do we apologize for wrongs that have happened, right? Is the United States going to apologize for slavery, right? Australia apologizes for the colonization of Aboriginal people in Australia, right? So do we apologize for these things? Do we reckon with our memories? And that is definitely important. That is an essential element to justice, but it also leads us to a fundamental question, right? Which is, what histories do we pay attention to? What historical injustices do we focus on over others, right? Hegel reminds us that if we look backwards, what we see, he calls the slaughter bench of history, right? History is full of injustices. So which ones do we focus on? Which ones compel our attention? If we talk about historical injustice, it doesn't necessarily give us that ability to judge which histories we should be focusing on and why. Jeff Spinner-Halev wrote about this idea called enduring injustice. And this is connected to an historical injustice. It's an injustice from the past, but we're not focusing on the pastness of the injustice, right? For Spinner, the challenge is not just the injustice of the past, but that they still suffer from some material injustice in the present. That material injustice in the present is conditioned by what has happened in the past. It is connected to what's happened in the past, but it is an historical injustice that reverberates through to the present, where we still have present injustice, present inequality that we're faced with. For Spinner, this notion of an enduring injustice stems from what he calls a radical injustice in the past, and he gives a couple of categories. Radical dispossession, right? We can think of the removal of indigenous peoples in Australia, Canada, the United States from their land. Cultural dispossession as well. Living under pervasive discrimination or terror. And he sums all of this up by basically saying that radical injustice, It is a way of making us feel, or those who suffer from it, feeling not at home in the world. And I think that that's really important, right? That the people suffering from this do not feel as though they are fully integrated into the political community, that justice has been served to them, or that they are that they have been given a place to live in the present, but they're untethered from it in some way. And so this is what I think these hauntings attract us to, or they compel us to look for these moments where an historic injustice creates this reverberation into the present that winds up as this enduring injustice in the present, a present material injustice that is conditioned by the past, is lodged in the past, but it is very much a present concern. So how is this a haunting, right? What does it mean that we're haunted by these things? Well, drawing a little bit on Aristotle, it's the lingering presence of an absent thing, right? The radical injustice happens in the past, the historical injustice happens in the past, but the material effects are still being felt. And that's what we need to reckon with here, right? The continued presence of enduring injustice forces us to confront the radical injustice that's at its core, and that calls us to be responsible to that lingering, enduring injustice. Right? This presence is not simply historical or metaphorical, right? It is social, it's material, it's psychological, right? That's what these enduring injustices are, right? They have tangible, real effects in the world, and we can see them, we can feel them, and therefore we need to be held responsible for them. One of the things that a lot of my students pointed out, and I hadn't really thought about this until they brought it to my attention, but one of the things that you tend to see in haunted house movies is as the family becomes aware of the truth, like they finally become aware that this house is haunted, usually the house gets really messy, right? Windows fly open, things are all over the place, right? Wind is whipping through the rooms. The house is no longer neat and tidy. It's disordered, it's messy. And I think that in a way, when we're looking at this haunting, we're looking at the disordered state of our political society, right? That it's not neat, finely kept, managed, right? It is to some degree beyond our control. It is to some degree unmanageable. There's a wildness to it that escapes our ability to control everything. We do not have complete control. We do not have complete sovereignty over everything. Why? Because our political system in the present is influenced by the past, determined to a large degree by what we've inherited, right? What we haven't created. So we do not have this notion of complete sovereignty and control, which is a desire of modern people, right? We want to have that notion of complete sovereignty. We need to give into that a little bit. We're subject to forces beyond our own creation, but those forces impact our world, right? Sometimes for the better, sometimes because they create injustices that linger. And therefore we need to reckon with those impacts. So what are we to do, right? If we live in this disordered state, if we're experiencing these hauntings, experiencing these injustices, what's the response? How do we seek justice? What does justice look like in these cases? This is where I think Jeff Spinner gives us, again, a really interesting approach. We have to move beyond the traditional liberal conceptions of justice, right? Which we usually think of as like the contemporary civil justice system, right? There's someone who has suffered a wrong. There's someone who's the guilty party. The person who suffered gets restitution. Maybe it's material, money, something like that. This is actually a place where I think some of the criticisms of historical injustice and enduring injustice are actually kind of on the mark. You usually hear a lot of conservative or reactionary reactions to this sort of thing, saying things like, well, but I never owned a slave, right? So I'm not guilty, right, of any of this stuff. And I think that they're actually right about that, right? But it doesn't mean that this is still not something that we need to pursue. It means we need to pursue it in a slightly different register. We have to get beyond notions of guilt and innocence. We have to move from guilt to responsibility. Right? This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about guilty parties or not guilty parties. What we're talking about is responsibility and responsible parties. And why is this important? Why do we need to think in terms of this register of responsibility? Well, one, I think it's a way of thinking about these things as a collective response, right? We are collectively responsible for enduring injustices. It's not that one person must be held responsible or another person must be held responsible. It is a responsibility that we collectively share. It's a burden that we collectively share and have to own up to and live up to. It also allows us to think in terms of a political response, not simply an ethical response or a moral response. And here I'm thinking a little bit of Hannah Arendt's notion of this notion of simply combating the phrases of the world, where, are we looking for someone to stand up and apologize for an historical injustice? Sure, that would be wonderful, right? Do we want someone to apologize for breaking treaties with indigenous peoples? Sure, that's great. Right. But that does not change the fact that they were dispossessed from essentially a third of the entire North American continent. It doesn't do anything to address the fact that indigenous people living in reservations in the United States have the highest rate of alcoholism, drug abuse, lowest rate of high school graduation, lowest rate of college attendance out of any demographic in this country. Right. So we need a concerted political response. Right. Apologies are nice, but responsibility needs to go deeper than that, right? What is the responsibility to these enduring injustices that exist in the present? And again, this is a responsibility that needs to be collective because it's not about assigning guilt to a person. It's responsibility not for something we've done. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because again, we usually think of guilt or innocence responsibility when we're talking about something that has been done, right? This is an action that I've done and I'm taking responsibility for it. When we move into that collective register, what we're doing is we are looking at responsibility for what we've inherited, a system that we've inherited that does perpetuate injustice upon groups, upon individuals, and we need to step up to that responsibility. So the last thing I want to leave you with, I think, is a quote from Arendt, who captures this, I think, very nicely. There it is. This is from her collection of essays called Responsibility and Judgment. She says, we're here concerned with the case of collective and vicarious responsibility in which the member of a community is held responsible for things he did not participate in, but which were done in his name, right? I think what this means, to bring it back to this notion of haunting, is that we have a responsibility to understand, to reconcile with, and then be responsible for the disordered nature of the political society that we live in, that we've inherited, not necessarily for the wrongs that we have done, but for the wrongs that we can address and the wrongs that we can make better. And so it gives us a register in which to think about the striving for justice that is collective, that is political, material, and I think responds to the lingering effects of history without moving into this register of guilt or blame, which I think ultimately is not an effective strategy moving forward for reaching solutions. So that is as far as the project has gotten so far in its sort of sketched out form. So thank you all very much for listening. And I think it's my turn to pass it over to Dr. Abreu. Is that right?
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards.
Okay, let me stop sharing my screen and thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Ross, for that. Very enlightening. I'm gonna juxtapose Ross's haunted house with some pink clouds here. Where's my pink clouds? Okay. Everybody sees it? Good. Okay. Let me just. I don't like that I don't see anybody, so let me just open it up. All right. So thank you, Shiva, for inviting me to this. I really appreciate the invitation and to have this conversation about equity. To work off what Ross was talking about, this presentation is really about, how do we, at a practical level, now that we're trying to do the work, how do we recenter our social justice work with equity mindfulness? And what we're going to be talking about today is not only equity, but the importance of language, right? You know, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, right? DEI work, and a lot of time we group them all together. We just say DEI or the work, right? And I just wanted to, one thing that I learned in the last few years is how important it is to kind of dissect the language and really start understanding what are you talking about when you talk about each of those terms. When you talk about diversity, when you talk about equity, talk about social justice. And the idea is that the way you speak about these things are going to lead to certain questions and lead you to look at the problem in a certain kind of way, right? So today we'll talk about the importance of language. We'll discuss the difference between social justice terms, and we'll do a learning activity. We'll have like mini vignettes, and then I'll have some closing remarks. So the importance of language, right? The way that we speak about something eventually gets into our cognitive frame, right? Which is the attitude and beliefs that shape how we think about a problem, which then leads to certain questions and behaviors. With social justice, the cognitive frames that we often use are the following: diversity, deficit, equity, justice, inclusion. So we'll work through some of these. We won't have time to dive into all of them, but we're definitely gonna be focusing on the first three right there: diversity, deficit, and equity, and how that impacts the work that we do. Specifically the social. So what's the difference? Right. So a lot of times when you're working either as a social worker, as a therapist, an educator, and you're working in a low-income community, underserved community, we see a problem and we want to fix it. And the way we try to fix the problem is by fixing what's wrong with the people that we serve, right? This tends to fall into this deficit mindfulness, right? We look at the people that we're serving as missing something, and only if they had it, they would be better off. And the way we talk about people, we usually describe them as underprepared, underserved, urban, minorities. And this vagueness doesn't really allow us to talk about specific about who the people are, which then leads into not really providing the specific needs that they need, the specific resources that they need. So we try to fix the problem with basic skills, remediation, client development. And some of the language I use, I know I'm in CPA, so some of the language are geared towards therapy and therapeutic social work and of that nature. Sometime I'll talk about higher education because that's how I've learned to understand the topic. But with the deficit orientation to our work, we're saying, you know, this particular student needs to graduate, and the only way and what's stopping them from graduating is their reading level. And only if we provide remediation, basic skills for reading or for writing, they'll get through. In higher education, the way that looks like is we provide tutoring, we provide basic courses, right? Non-credit bearing courses. And some students have to go through a whole semester taking these courses that don't count don't count towards their graduation, towards their degree, but it does count as part of the financial aid that they're picking apart, right? And the hope is that if they engage with these remedial supports, remedial services, that eventually they'll have the skills that they need to be successful, either in school, either in their home life, right? Either in their workplace. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, the goal is to identify what's wrong with a particular person and fix it, all right? And in the hopes that they'll become better. And I would say post 70s, 80s, definitely in the 90s, you start hearing terms like diversity, multiculturalism. And the goal with this was access and representation, right? This is when we saw with affirmative action, right? only if we open up the doors to more Black students in higher education, only if we open up access to our Black clients, they will be better off, right? And the way that we talk about these services and people tend to be diverse, multicultural, inclusiveness, right? This idea that if I set up my program and my services, right, my school in a certain type of way, that I am going to help all people, right? This concept that the tide rises all boats, right? That if I provide some of the basic needs for everybody, everybody's going to benefit from this. We also saw this play out in higher education through the increase of affinity groups, student groups, right? And the idea was if students feel represented in the school and the college, then they'll have a sense of belonging, which then will lead to academic success because they don't feel isolated, right? Let's create not only a diverse environment, but the diversity of resources and services that those groups need. So we fixed the problem with access, recognition, is also celebration, right? When we think about diversity and multiculturalism, we say in order for these people to feel connected to either the organization, right, the school, we need to celebrate them, right? We see this play out in Hispanic Heritage Month, right? Black History Month. What was the other month, right? Women's History Month, whatever the month is, or whatever the celebration is, our goal is let's recognize them, let's celebrate them, let's celebrate our diversity as a way to get folks to feel a sense of belonging, and ultimately feel part of the community, which and then leads to success. In more recent time, the word equity has come up, right? And again, I feel like in these spaces, not this one in particular, but in DEI spaces, we group everything together, right? DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And nobody ever picks that apart, right? Like, what are we actually talking about, right? Well, equity, the primary goal is to give people what they need to succeed, the specific what they need to succeed. And I'm sure most of you have know this a version of this image, right? And I'll give everybody a second to just read through it. I don't want to read through it. So equity, equality, equity, and justice. And then we'll touch base a little bit on justice, but for this, like in that image, right, we gave that boy the extra box that they needed to look over the fence and watch the game, right? What this helps us when we speak about equity and we speak in these terms, we're grounded in the idea of referring to specific people that we're talking about. We're not just saying this is a diverse institution. We're saying that in this institution, 35% of the students are Black, right? 25% are Latino, Latina, or Latinx, right? That people are indigenous in this group, especially, and even more specific, as I put an asterisk right there. Sometimes you got to be even more specific when necessary, right? That these folks that we have, 60% Pell Grant recipients, which is an indication that we're serving low-income students, right? And when you're specific about the terms, now you're able to target the people that you're trying to help, right? So instead of saying that we're diverse, we say, no, we got to help Black students and provide the resources that allow Black students to succeed, right? Because when we talk about just diverse, we're talking about a whole bunch of folks that looks very different in different parts of the country. So how do we fix that problem, right? This allows us to aggregate the data by demographics, right? It also puts in the position where we're being critical, self-reflective, right? Where we're putting the mirror up to ourselves and saying, what am I doing as a professor, as a teacher, as a therapist, as a psychologist that's contributing to inequity, right? because what happens with the other frames is that it doesn't provide any framework to be critically self-reflexive, right? Which means that not only do I recognize my shortcomings in addressing equity issues, but I also have a plan to do something about it, right? And then when you're able to understand different groups of people and their needs and where they're at, then you provide specific resources to those particular groups. This also leads to more policy and structural analysis, right? And we start now diving into a little bit more justice, right? Where if we go back to that image that I just shared, the last one, the justice one, the fence was changed, right? The structure of the fence was changed because it was a wooden fence and then it was a chain link fence, which now everybody can see through it, and now you don't need any boxes. But you can't get there if you don't have any type of structural analysis of your organization and understanding at what point, at what policies or institutional practices are contributing to inequities and who exactly is being impacted by this. To have a more nuanced conversation, we're going to play a little game. So I'm going to provide, I think I could keep it, right? All right. So I'm gonna present, and in the chat, everybody is going to say, is that a diversity statement? Is that a deficit statement? Or is that an equity statement, right? So we're gonna work through a couple of statements, and then I'm gonna provide some context afterwards. And the point is to have a more nuanced discussion about the topic. Right. So the first one, right? My clients lack the motivation to do the therapeutic work they need. Where's my chat? Why is my chat not coming up? I can't see the chat.
I'm happy to read some of the answers in the chat if that's helpful, Joshua.
Okay. All right. Let me know.
Sure. Most of the participants are saying this is a deficit statement.
Deficit statement, correct. So let me go back to there you go. We hear this all the time, right? I spent 4 years doing social work in Lawrence, Massachusetts, right, for DCF. And I did some social work and higher education. And then I was in higher education. And this is a constant thing, right? We talk about our students, our clients lacking motivation, but yet again, they're showing up to class most of the time, maybe not doing all the work, but showing up pretty regularly while having, 2 jobs and working 30, 40 hours a week, right? And having all this responsibility. So, we put this onus on them, like the reason why you're struggling is because you don't have the motivation, right? And then what does that do, right? It doesn't position us to see what am I doing that it makes it seem that you don't have any motivation, right? So yes, whoever said it was a deficit, you're correct. Let's go to the next one. Why don't we look at our organizational data so we can better understand our clients based on race, ethnicity, and gender?
Okay, most of the folks are identifying this as a diversity statement. I think there's one vote for an equity statement.
Who's that? Who said equity?
Oh, let's see. Do you want to unmute yourself if you said equity?
Whoever said equity, you could expand on it if you want.
I see John Suzak mentioned equity. I think there's like 2 or 3. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. So I think there's 2 that said equity, and then
John, you wanna speak to what made you say equity? Oh, you're muted. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I have a special button. Well, I think I was the first one to vote, so it's with some trepidation. It seems to me that the specificity that you were calling for, Joshua, in your description of equity best aligned with this one, and that's what led me to say it.
Right, right. You know, I think some of these might seem somewhat obvious, right? But the reason why I'm bringing it up, because in real life, people don't do some of this, right? Like there's a bunch of organizations that are afraid of really dissecting their data and understanding what are the experiences based on demographics, on how people are experiencing the services that we're provided, right? That self critique is not easy to do, and it requires some type of bravery, some type of courage. But you're not doing equity work if you're not taking these steps, right? So again, sometimes we talk about we're doing some social justice work with DEI work, but there's certain behaviors that has to come with definitely with equity. And this is one of those behaviors where you're looking at the organization and understanding through data, how are we impacting the people that we're serving, your clients or students.
Joshua, before you continue, Maya asked,
Yes.
wouldn't diversity also just be focused on how is there and not their experience of the organization? How can they distinguish between diversity and equity?
I think the way I've come to understand it, that equity is really putting the ball in your court, like you as a practitioner are taking steps to analyze the structure and the practices of the institution, as opposed to diversity. You're providing a service in hopes that that service, either celebrates them, recognize them, and not to say that that's not important. I mean, I think recognizing Hispanic Heritage Month is important, as we're going to see with the next one. But it's equity without diversity without equity is not really getting us anywhere, right? A celebration without really doing some data analysis in order to understand how we actually impacting people, understanding certain outcomes, either student outcomes or client outcomes. I think it falls short from equity if you're not taking that step.
I just wanted to quickly say something. I think what makes this a little bit challenging for some are that it's hard to say whether they're acting on this or whether they're just kind of seeing those differences at a systematic level. And so it's easier when we know what they're doing once they collect this.
Well, yeah.
So it's harder to decipher that when you're looking at like a mission statement or just what they're what they're reflecting on, but then also how are they acting? Because I know that's what was tricky for me in deciding with this one was, okay, they can look at that, but then are they going to actually make actions that will help get everyone on that same playing field?
Right.
That was my struggle with this one.
Right. And this is just to have a conversation, right? This isn't like these statements are just meant to be gray and stuff like that in order to have a nuanced conversation. But yes, I mean, and what I'm trying to emulate is conversations that happen in real life, and then how do you kind of prod for more, right? How do you probe for more? Like, okay, now that we know the data, we're gonna do something, right? And if anything, that's a step towards justice, right? Because now you're trying to create some type of structural change based on your data analysis. All right, a couple more here. For Hispanic Heritage Month, let's set up a booth to increase our clientele. What are we getting?
I believe there's a close to unanimous vote for diversity. I see one response for deficit.
Right. So I will categorize this as diversity, right? This idea of recognition, celebration, increased access, right? Let's increase access, and then this place will be more diverse. Increase access without working towards equitable outcomes. That's when you see some tension, right? That's when you see people kind of within institution kind of bumping heads, right? We open up the doors, but we're not set up to provide the services that the people that are coming through the doors need in order for them to be successful, right? So this is a diversity based statement that focuses on increasing access. Again, not to say access is not important, but opening up the door without providing services, especially in higher education. I will also say in mental health, it's borderline. You're exploiting the needs of the people, right? You open up access without providing realistic opportunity for them to be successful, right? To be better, and not to say that you're gonna be 100% correct, right, in terms of getting people up and going, but there needs to be a conversation about, now that they're here, what do we do, right? What do these particular people need in order for them to be successful? All right.
Also, Joshua, I'm sorry, because
sorry.
these are important. Different. Robert says the phrasing suggests that recruitment of Hispanics is not good in itself, but it's instrumental to increasing our numbers.
Say that again.
Robert, would you like to share this? Because this is very important.
I had trouble with this just because of the phrasing. And the phrasing says, let's increase our clientele. So it suggests that the recruitment of Hispanics is not pursued because it's good in itself, but because it increases our numbers. In other words,
All right.
if our aim is to boost our numbers, and if the way to get there is to have Hispanic Heritage Month booth, well, let's do that, because what we really want to do is increase our numbers. I mean, if they were Chinese, we'd want Chinese too, but let's just increase our number. So it's just the phrasing has a little suggestion of that kind of instrumentality about it. That's all.
Yeah. No, thank you, Robert, for that. And I again, I'm gonna refer to higher education. Institutions do this all the time. They'll highlight the Black unions, right? The Black student union and stuff like that, and say, as a way to attract students who care about diversity, right? Who care about a diverse environment, to show Black students that this is a safe place. Again, that's leaning towards diversity, not towards equity. You do need one, but without the other, it can set up folks to not be successful. All right, so I can't help my Black clients because they don't engage during sessions.
Let's see. It looks like the majority of votes are for deficit.
Deficit. Yeah, I mean, the way when folks talk like this, I try to redirect them and say, I can't help my Black clients because I haven't found a way to engage them. Right? I haven't found a way to engage them. That's it, right? I need to find a way to engage my students, right? Throwing up your hand in the air and saying that they're not engaged, so I can't help them. It just doesn't put you in a position to make the behaviors that you need to make in order to address the needs of your students. The next one. Oh, yes. Clients receive limited resource on the issues impacting them the most. This may be the reason for low client retention.
So far, the votes are coming in as an equity statement.
Yes. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but You're acknowledging that they're not getting what they need, and maybe that's the reason for low retention, right? All right, next one. To help our Black clients, we should hire more Black therapists. And for the educators in the room, more Black educators.
There are 2.5 votes for equity, and the majority of other participants are identifying this as a diversity statement.
Diversity statement. This is always a battle, right? This is always a battle, at least in education, where you want to diversify the academy as a way to respond to the needs of your students, but it could get you in some trouble situation if you're not really looking for what students need. And not see, a lot of us are also trained in the dominant way of, we went to, a lot of us went to PWIs, right? Like white institutions. A lot of us weren't trained to work with certain populations, right? A lot of us were like the only ones in our family to go to college and stuff like that, right? That doesn't mean just because I look like my students, I know what to do with my students, right? There's certain ways, there's certain skills and resources that everybody needs in order to address the needs of the people in front of you. And this is always a battle in hiring practices and hiring committees, where you want to make sure that the pool is diverse, but you definitely don't want to be in a situation where you're hiring somebody just because they look like your students. They gotta they gotta be able to have the skills to do the work. So this tends to be a diversity statement.
I know, like, for me, I kind of said I was in between because I felt like it depended on the purpose behind why they're recruiting, so if they're doing it because maybe some students felt would feel more comfortable having a role model that's similar to them, then maybe that could be more equity. But if they're just doing it without that, then it's more diverse.
Right.
That's why I
Right. But when you talk to Black students, they'll tell you, like, I don't need a role model. Like, I need somebody that knows how to teach me, that keeps me high standards and stuff like that, right? Like, yeah, it's just one of those things where I think it's like low-hanging fruits. It's like, oh, we just throw in more diverse faculty, and the institution, the practices of the institution doesn't have to do anything. It was like, oh, we just hire more Black professors. And like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about structural issues that if your whole faculty were Black, it's not going to resolve the structural issue.
I just want to put forth a comment from Bonnie in the chat, and you're kind of speaking to this issue, Joshua. Bonnie says, our students always say that they wish they saw more administrators, faculty, and staff that look like them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, I think a lot of time, and I don't want to speak for them. I think a lot of times that's a loaded statement coming from students, and that I hope they look like me because they understand me and know what to do and how to support me. And you're tying the look into all these skills and knowledge that is potentially there. And sometimes they are there, right? Like, I grew up in a city just like New Haven, and I understand a lot of the stuff that they're going through. But there's also things that I don't understand. So I think a lot of times, we got to help our students also recognize that, all skinfolk and kinfolk, like, and not everybody knows how to work with certain population. And a lot of us had to kind of play the mainstream agenda in order to be successful in higher education, get that PhD. And nobody trained us how to deal with like retention issues or like student needs, I got an education degree, and nobody taught me about like critical pedagogy and how to deal with Black students. I had to go elsewhere for that. That's not to say that you don't try to diversify your thing. I mean, I'm just having, I'm just pushing the limits here a little bit for the sake of conversation. Last two. I was trained only in one modality of therapy. I need to find some trainings to expand my skill set.
I see 2 votes for deficit, and the majority of other votes are for equity.
I can see how it's deficit. When you're talking about yourself, you're like, I was only right. I can see how that could be a deficit. I was thinking equity just because the person is reflecting. I only know how to do one type of therapy. I mean, let's say talk therapy. Maybe I need to find out different ways to engage different clients with different needs. Not everybody wants to sit there and talk to me, right? Maybe we need to do some more, incorporate art, incorporate music, or incorporate some play therapy, especially when you're working with younger kids. So just recognizing your skill set and where you need some improvement, and this that tends to have some equitable outcomes, because now you're providing skill set that a diverse of clients could benefit from. All right, last one. What if we experimented with new culturally responsive clinical practices and evaluate their effectiveness?
Sorry, I was muted. So far, all the votes that were coming in are identifying this as an equity statement. I actually don't see any outliers. I think everyone is identifying this as an equity statement.
Right. Yes, it's equity statement, right? Again, it's just recognizing what you may need and taking what we call in academia, at least where I'm from, scholar practitioner approach, where you are, you're taking a scholarly approach to your practice, right? You're experimenting with new ideas, and you're assessing its effectiveness and making adjustments according to what you find, what works, what doesn't work. And that leads to equity, because regardless of who's in the room, the needs of students, the needs of clients evolve over time, and depending on where you're teaching or where you're doing therapy, the needs of the people there also are different from different location, different geographical location. So if you constantly have this as your practice, you're constantly putting yourself in a situation where you're responding to the needs of the people in front of you, your students or your clients. Either you do this now or you do that 30 years from now when the needs are different. You're always going to be in a position where you're responding to the people in front of you. So thank you for participating. Again, I guess my bigger message here is just being aware, especially in social work, social justice work, of how language is impacting how you understand and address the particular problem, right? We all want certain groups of people to thrive, especially those who have been historically marginalized. We respect the importance of not only doing it for moral reasons, right, humane reasons, but also more instrumental reason, like we as a society are better when more people are thriving. And then how do we get there? And what I've learned over time is that you get there by being really critically self-reflective, and really looking at yourself, your practices, as well as looking at institutional practices, and not putting so much onus on your clients, on your students, to make the changes, right? That their change is dependent on how you change and how you approach your work. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was pretty engaging and involving. Thank you everyone for your participation. So if you have questions from Dr. Edwards and Dr. Abreu, feel free to ask.
I have maybe it's more of a comment than a question for Ross, which is that implied, and even more than implied here and there, when you mentioned about the historical nature of a community, is the kind of integument that ties us to the past, that, you know, all things have a past. We are in some ways stepping into a story that was written before us. Without even knowing it, we're unconsciously replaying certain conflicts of interest that have defined us in the past, and now we're stepping into it in our generation and dealing with them. So this is just a comment on, it's almost mystical, the fact that we don't know these people, we weren't there, but we are part of the story. We're part of the story, and it has caught us up in it. And it's important, I think, in education, which you are doing so well, Ross, but it's important to develop this historical consciousness so that we can see that these are patterns. They're not just one-time events, that they are recurring patterns, and they have a you know, a determinative effect on our lives. You mentioned apologies aren't enough. There's been a lack of willingness to even get to apologies in some countries. Like I think of Japan, that every time they write a history book, the Chinese go nuts because they're not acknowledging what they did to Southeast Asian nations. And I think Germany is an outlier by, you know, officially confronting its past. I think there's a bubbling up from the bottom up about acknowledging our complicity as a historical community, but we haven't gone as far as Germany has. But it's very important because it bears on the question of whether we are really a single community or not. Like you mentioned, some people are here, but they're subordinate. Mm-hmm. They're the ghosts in the house. So that was very interesting, Ross, and very creative and very, very thought-provoking.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, part of the larger project kind of goes into this discussion of sovereignty, which I think, you know, is a very modern concept. And there's something about it that's really interesting, which is sovereignty tends to be very presentist, which is to say, like, you know, we are sovereign of ourselves right now. We have complete control and complete sovereignty in our space and our time, which ignores the historicity of it, right? That we may be sovereign, right? We may have political control, but we exist, like you said, within a political community that has the past, and the past comes through to our existence right now. So, you know, I really think that, you know, one of the challenges, I think, like socially, psychologically, of making those apologies is it's sort of an acknowledgement that we do not have complete and utter control over, you know, our political existence in the present moment, right? We are buffeted around by these forces of the past and injustices that keep coming forward, which I think is one of the reasons why, again, I mean, like in the United States, the poll done in like the early 2000s, 80% of the country was opposed to an apology for slavery, right? Not a reparation, right? Not some kind of material consideration, but literally just an official government apology for slavery. Like 80% of the country, right, was opposed. I mean, it was shocking, right? There's something about that inability to confront it, even on that most basic level. Sorry, I should say 80% of white Americans were opposed to an apology for slavery.
It reminds me of an logical framework, I think it's called for nurturing, and it's this idea that for new
Josh,
parents,
you're breaking up.
oh, hear me?
Yeah.
You're kind of going in and out a little bit.
Still going in and out? Am I good?
I think so.
It's better.
But okay. It reminds me of the psychological framework, goals of the nurse, and it aligns present in that the new parents are gonna come in like a new kid.
Mm-hmm.
The goals of like use of the generation.
Joshua, Unfortunately, we cannot hear you.
Yeah,
Oh.
you're going in and out again. Sorry.
All right, forget it.
I do want to hear what you're saying though, so I'm gonna stop by your office at some point.
You can type it
Yeah.
in the chat too if you want. We can all.
Yeah, I don't know what's.
While Josh is typing his response as a follow-up to that question, are there other questions or comments from our participants here?
I have a question. I'm a solo private practitioner in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, pretty homogenous environment. And I was just wondering what recommendations you guys have to take these sort of global concepts and make them more concrete in day-to-day private practice, whether it's, on any level, just thinking next steps that I can do or others can do.
Am I good? I'm gonna make it quick. Oh God. I would say have some type of like self-assessment or like assessing your clients, like asking them to like to review you, to like, well, how am I doing? Like, like in the moment, not at the end, right? But like in the moment, so you get some feedback from them and you start breaking down the power dynamic between you and your clients, where they're just looking at you as the person who's guided them, but instead you're putting them in the position to critique you and give you feedback, and then you make adjustments according to what you find.
That's great. Thank you.
Ross, you have.
I thought that was a great answer.
Any other questions? That was those points that were raised, very important. Thank you both. Any other questions? Okay, so
I don't have a question per se, but I just have a comment. Josh, this is really a comment of appreciation. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the pervasiveness and power really of white supremacist culture in our training and in academia, and how that really influences our policies and decision-making and how we approach EDI work. I think that was very clever with your EDI kind of practice statements and having us go through that. Because I think we can begin to see how we can kind of be drawn into what looks like diversity champions, but bringing more folks to the table, specifically folks of color in an institution that doesn't really support their humanness is really violent, actually. So I appreciate you just acknowledging that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the acknowledgement, the recognition. This work could be isolating, nobody wants to hear, the VPs and presidents don't want to hear how they're messing up. And not them themselves, but the institution that they're responsible for is messing up. And it takes a lot of convincing to tell them that any well-balanced person is critically reflective. And at the end of it all comes down to, what did I do and didn't do? And am I happy with it? Right? It's not who did what and somebody else. So it takes a lot of work to convince leadership to take a strong look inward into their institution and recognize where we're messing up, where we're not doing too well, and where we're not serving the people that we're taking money from.
thank you. So, and thank you for your question, Jenna, and Khan's statement. So it's almost the end of our session. I just want to acknowledge Alberta's colleagues that are still in the office. We had
Right, yo, warriors, man.
we had open house tonight, so everybody is in the office. So I really appreciate that you are participating from your offices right now. Possibly you get back home like really late at night. But let's close the session. Neda, would you please do that?
Of course. So we want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I would like to end by mentioning that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series is through fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you are able to support, the donation link is in the chat, or it's going to be put into the chat. I would also like to invite you to complete our needs assessment link that is being added to the chat now. Your responses will help us improve future sessions. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next month.
Thank you again, Dr. Edwards, Dr. Abreu. Excellent. Thank you all for your participation. We look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I learned every time I attend something, I learned so much. So I appreciate both of your perspectives and your background. And I really liked the activities you included, Joshua, like making us actually apply these skills, because it's very easy to sit here and like it makes sense, but then when you see statements trying to decipher can be very challenging.
Right. And I'm sure if you haven't done, if you haven't heard some of those statements, yeah, I'm sure you going to hear. And that's what the work lies, when people say certain things and you're trying to negotiate with hiring somebody or not hiring somebody, and what courses to do, what not courses to do. You know.
But even just when you mentioned about like hiring people of color, I guess with my background and the way I've been reared in academia, you know, there was this big emphasis of how it's so important to have mentors, people that look like them, and they exaggerate that so much. But then when you made that comment, I'm thinking back to most of the people I know in my program that were from like African-American backgrounds. Many of them came from backgrounds where, you know, their parents came from a really different socioeconomic background than the students were serving, and they may not necessarily know how to relate. And so,
Right.
you know, and so I do think like it just hit me when you brought that up that I'm like, I never even put those things together. But
and
there are so many factors that we don't think about because we're so blinded by.
And it undermines my skill set, right? So when my students tell me, "Oh man, I'm happy that you're a Black Latino male and teaching me," and the reason why they're learning is not because I'm a Black Latino male, it's because of the skills and knowledge and the way I'm teaching, right? So you put an alien from outer space and you tell them to do the thing that we're doing in class, the kids are gonna learn, right? So it undermines my work, right, to just my race and my gender and my age, saying, I'm learning because you're a Black Latino. No. You're learning because of the strategies that I've learned over time and learn and keep learning, and how, you know, how I'm doing the class, right? And I think there's power of representation, but after the first day of class, you got to go to work. Like, it's not about how I look, you know? And a lot of Black people understand this. Of course they understand that, like.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So if you have more questions, feel free to stay. If not, have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.